Good morning, and welcome to Old Fashioned Sunday School on the 19th day of September 2021. We are here, but we're also on Zoom, and we're on YouTube, and we're on several other platforms whose names I cannot remember, but our wizard, Dan Murphy, has set it all up. I want to say at the outset that we're still playing with some of this. Last week, I understand that YouTube decided the music videos I showed were violating somebody's copyright, so they cut us off. That's not true. I've done extensive research. We can do what I do. Having said all of that, we're going to get some of that squared away. So if you're waiting to watch it later, be aware that you need to check the source for it. Also, we're going to have time for questions throughout. I'm going to try to repeat your questions, not only to see if I've got it right, but also because the people who run Zoom can't hear you. If it looks like the two of us aren't making that happen very effectively, then Mac is going to swoop in with a microphone. So one way or the other, you get to ask your question, which are meaningful and powerful for our experience, and the people on Zoom get to hear it, which is probably even more important. I don't get complaints from you guys very much, but they always send emails after class. So I want that experience to be a good one. Well, I'm excited to be here. We are, as you know, continuing to track Mark. But the way we're doing it is to follow the lectionary, the Sunday lectionary that we're reading in church. So typically our class will be on the gospel reading. That was true last week, and it'll be true again this week. My hope is that we not only get through Mark, but also we enrich your worship experience. So if you look at the anthem this morning, for example, the offertory anthem, you will see a wonderful and beautiful statement about the topics that we're going to talk about today. Or if you look at the lyrics of the hymns, you'll see some of the interpretations of children, for example, that we're going to talk about today. I don't think they're the right ones, but there they are. So you ought to know that they're there. So in preparing for class, I invite you to read the gospel at least once earlier in the week and kind of let it sit with you as you continue to think about it. You will find first that the sermons are a whole lot better. So that's a good thing. But also, hopefully, it'll let you participate in class more meaningfully because you will have already thought a bit about what makes sense or does not make sense to you about all of that. All right. Well, we ended last week on a kind of energetic high with Stevie Wonder and Higher Ground. I want to start this week with a more meditative posture. So we're going to listen to a meditation by Howard Thurman. He both wrote and is narrating this meditation. It comes from his work, Meditations of the Heart.
How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see one's self pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity we seek, ere the quiet passes, a fresh sense of order in our living. A direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis And where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure? And what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment as we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence. There is a sound of another kind, a deeper note which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. We wait. Our questions are answered. Our spirits refreshed. And we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down.
I love that piece. I love Howard Thurman, of course, but I think in that meditation you have a summary of the spiritual life, all of it. How we center down is to say, how do we find the God that is within us? Learn to listen to God's voice. Learn to heed God's will. Discern whether that's actually God's voice or not. And we do that by centering down, as Thurman says. We're going to explore this morning some of the habits, some of the practices that may allow us to center down, and some of the distractions and obstacles to that effort. And we're going to do it using the gospel as our frame of reference. The gospel is the gospel according to Mark, and we're going to start in the 9th chapter with the 33rd verse. When they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." That must have been really fun for the disciples. Where I want to start is this idea of fighting about who's the greatest. We go over the scripture every week in our staff meetings, and I took some pleasure in telling the staff about the sheep and the goats. Remember that judgment passage? And the key there is not to be a goat, and yet, GOAT as an acronym is the greatest of all time. I thought I'd made a brilliant point. One of our younger staff members said, "George, nobody says that anymore." I said, "Well, you didn't go to North Carolina. We say it all the time." Nevertheless, this is interesting. They're on the road arguing about who is the greatest. We have, as we discussed last week, just started the second cycle of Mark, the second call to discipleship. The first part has been rooted in miracles, as if to say, this is what the reconciled community looks like. This is who we become. This is how our social relationships are configured. This is what love and peace looks like. And now we're going to talk about how you can make that happen. As if to amplify their confusion and ignorance, they're off worrying about their own personal power. Defining power exactly the opposite is the way Jesus had just spent the first part of the journey describing it. It's not just that they don't get it, it's that they're running the other way. And so Jesus brings them into what is a teaching configuration. He calls the 12 together. He sits down as a rabbi might before holding class and says to them, you got it all wrong. If you want to be first, you're going to have to be last. And then as if to prove his point, he brings a small child and says, whoever welcomes this child welcomes me. Now the gospel says in my name, but commentators and scholars believe that's a later addition. Whoever welcomes this child welcomes me, and not just me, but God, the one who sent me. So there are two very profound themes, I think, in the gospel passage this morning. The first is about power. And the idea that if you want to be first, you have to be last, which is about service and servanthood. The second is about power. And if you want to welcome the child, you welcome God. Well, since one is more abstract and the other is kind of concrete, I want to start with the second, with the idea of the child. Why do you think Jesus chose a child?
How
What's fun about these presentations is every week it's a different problem. So, you never get bored, really. Why do you think Jesus told a child to make this point? Because the child has no power? And what do you mean when they say the child has no power? What kind of power don't they have? Okay, no power to understand God. No, or what I might call coercive power, right? No power to make anybody do anything. Yeah, I don't either. Yeah. But yes, I think that's an excellent answer. The child has no power. Yeah, disruptive power, she called it, yes. Which it has an interesting double connotation, right? In the technology world, disruptive is this wonderfully good and profitable thing, but in Julia's story, a little unwelcome, yeah. It was an excellent sermon, yes. The child has innocence. Free of some of these things that are calling them to want the coercive power that they were arguing about. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I like that. The child is the future. So, I love this. Can you say just a little bit more about it? What power does the child have in that moment?
Well, I guess I'm just thinking about how, in so many ways, like our job as parents is to pass on our traditions to our children, to carry forth the next generation, to be productive members of society, to carry on, those virtues our religion.
Right. So the child has a symbolic power of representing the future. Yeah. 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 Good. Kathy, you had your hand up.
Children are often ignored and overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Children are ignored and overlooked. Yes. Yeah. So attention, just the mere power of paying attention. Yeah.
I think
Whichever one of you is not running for office, yeah.
I think children in general, relative to other people, don't necessarily care about their status. They don't care about being greater than someone else.
They're innocent in a way of that, yeah. Harrison.
I think it's also interesting the aspect that a child brings along the power of responsibilities and the power of it requiring a mature pastor, someone who is reliant on.
Like that. So it evokes things out of us, a sense of responsibility and compassion, perhaps. Another way of having power. Interesting. There was another hand over here I thought I missed. Totally selfish. Yeah. So define selfish for us. Self-focused and absorbed, yeah. 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 I wonder if they're self-loving at that point. We'll come back to that. What else? Why the child? These are excellent points. So I want to tell you that this teaching discourse begins with the example of the child and ends with the example of the child. At this, whatever point Jesus is making is bookending all of his teachings about first and last. And there are three basic ways that I've seen this question answered, all of which you've already covered, but by way of summary, one is that the child is trusting and innocent, that they are pure somehow in a way that we're not pure, and therefore representative of how we're supposed to be pure in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So think of the beatitude, to be pure in heart, for example. I haven't found children to be all that pure, nor have I found them to be all of that innocent. So I feel sometimes when I hear that, which is, by the way, not to use the word innocence as you used it. I think that was a more sophisticated take. It tends to idealize children and turn them into something that isn't really human, right, for purposes of whatever the preacher or commentator is trying to achieve. So the second way that I've seen it treated, it was how Chad Myers treats it in his treatise, Unbinding the Strong Man, which we've been following, this socio-political take on the Gospel of Mark, and that is that the child is not only powerless in the way that we were first using power, but also often the victim of violence, on the edge of society. They were thought at that time, in Galilee in particular, to be really almost an afterthought, which is kind of strange to me. Now we, since I don't know when it was that the big change occurred, but now we think we hold children up, we put them on a pedestal. If you track art of children, you can see when this happened. But it's hard to think of somebody ignoring the child and not paying attention to them when we're so focused on them today. But that was the sense. So they were on the margins. They were the last. So welcoming them in was including them into the circle of the community, much like the blind or the deaf or the lame or the lepers. Remember, in all of those healing stories, in the first teaching cycle, there is a reaching out beyond the circle of acceptability and an inclusion of people that are there, or if you will, drawing the circle wider. But I think another part of Myers' take is really speaks to me in a powerful way, and that is how much children do suffer whenever anything bad happens, right? So when poverty besets a family, or when difficult separation or divorce besets a family, or any of the things that create trouble, who suffers the most? It is invariably the children, who are sadly the least able to help themselves. Accordingly, they are the ones that need us the most, right? And caring for children and child poverty and child abuse and all of the other ways that we can care for children, be responsible for them, is a great calling, right? There are many people that believe that we can judge our society by how we treat those who are at the least amount of power, and children are right in among that group. Meyer spends a lot of time talking about the trauma that children experience when their environment is not safe and loving. When, if you're an attachment, what is it, a theory? What is attachment? Anyway, the idea that attaching to that child gives them security from which they can enter the world. If you're not attached and suffer the anxiety of that loss or lack of attachment, your whole life is affected. We, earlier in our conversations last year, talk about My Grandmother's Hands. Do you remember that book and the practices of it? And it was all the trauma that racism has inflicted on people and how children take that trauma and hold that trauma in their body. And the same is true of victims of natural disasters. I mean, the more we learn about how our body functions with our mind, the more we learn how important it is for children to be attached and loved and cared for, and how tragically devastating it can be when they're not. So I think Myers makes a kind of general point about bringing folks in from the margin, the victims of violence, and uses children for that purpose, but then goes deeper and says they are particularly vulnerable. And the way we deal with that vulnerability says something about the nature of our community and, in fact, the nature of love, right? To be looking out for those who can't look out for themselves, giving voice to those who can't speak. Those are all metrics that we could use to measure the love and compassion of our society and the way we have organized things. So I think Jesus is making a very profound point. The first use of children, by the way, comes right after his teachings on divorce. So there is some sense that it's the family dynamic he's focused on and the need and to care for children in that way. And then the third way, which I've taken from Jerome Berryman, who is the creator of Godly Play, is to say that children are the means of grace. Children are the means of grace, which is to say that when we engage or encounter a child, we are experiencing God through them. Now, some of that, I think, is a sense of compassion or responsibility that they bring forth in us, but I think it's more than that. They are the means of grace in part because we see the future in their eyes, but they're also the means of grace because they spend less time asking the questions that Thurman is pondering, right? They are more curious. They are more creative in many ways. They are more creative because if you think about the creative process of kind of looking at what's out there and then processing it and then coming up with some kind of hypothesis and then coming to a resolution, the cycle of how we think about the world and engage it, children seem, so the researchers tell us, to go through that process more smoothly than we do, to actually participate in the flow of creative thought more smoothly and equally than we do. Most of us, by personality or training, tend to focus on one of those areas. So I like to scan stuff, but I don't like to actually go any further than that, right? I'm happiest when I'm just pointing out to you all the things that might be wrong, right? And then I'm going to brunch. Y'all have fun. Or there are others that constantly are coming up with hypotheses, right? Constantly coming and telling us what's wrong and what we ought to be doing about it as if they knew exactly what was happening. Others who only want to be putting that into place, etc. So you can see by our vocational choices and personality how we tend to favor one over the other. But Berryman says you don't have to get into all this fancy psychological theory. Just pay attention when you look into the face of a child, what they do to you, how they open you, how their mere presence can create an awareness of God's presence. While you look into the face of a newborn child and suddenly you're making these faces like, what are you doing? Right? Well, I know what you're doing, or at least what I'm doing. That child's going to make the face back to me, right? And so that's fun and exciting. And then to watch them grow is fun and exciting. And I get a sense of God's presence through my engagement with that child. And it didn't happen in my head or through some book I read or a complicated theory that I articulated yesterday. It was just that engagement with the child. Think, for example, about our baptism, where often, often we will parade around the congregation with the child, and you just want to see that child, right? The bishop likes to hold the child up. Have you noticed that? So the first time the bishop was here, I was baptizing a child, and it was a family I knew, and I love these people, and I was privileged to be there, and I was feeling the moment, and I turned the child over to the bishop so he could make the chrism on her forehead, and he grabbed her, and I'm like, no, this is my child. You can put the oil on her forehead, but you cannot have her. And we literally had this moment of struggle. And finally, I'm like, George, get a grip on yourself. And the bishop took her and held her up, and everybody applauded, and it was all wonderful. But I obviously still remember that moment. It was too funny. But so Jerome Berryman offers this painting as an example of what he's talking about, the sacramental character of children and how they show forth God and how they bring forth an awareness of God from us. And you can, I think, just see it in that painting, the colors, the engagement, the look on those children's faces, and the movement of that adult into those children to grab those children. Yes.
I love the look, I assume that's an apostle of the sacramental level, and I love the look of incredulity on his face. Really, Jesus?
Yeah, what is this doing for my portfolio exactly? Yeah, yeah, right, yeah. Yeah. Right. Matt can do that. We're being too childlike in our conversation. All right. Well, do you get the basic point, though? We have talked about innocence as children. My take on that is there's truth there, but it tends to lend itself to objectifying the child, as if there's some abstract concept of, before the fall. And then we've talked about the social consequences of violence and poverty on children, and how our social structure either pays attention to that or doesn't, and what that says about the presence of God in the kingdom of heaven. And then I've tried to wrap all of that into Berryman's idea that children are sacraments, outward and visible signs of an inward and invisible grace. And that happens because of what they evoke from us. Their mere presence changes us in ways that make God more present to us. So that's what I think Jesus might be saying, or at least what we might take from Jesus as a concrete example. So let's go back to what he said before. Because what he said before is, if you want to be first, you got to be last, and you got to be a servant, right? And he says this in other places. One of my favorite comes a little bit later in Mark, when he starts talking about where you sit at the table. Do you remember this? He said, who's got the power? Who's the greatest? The one who sits at the head of the table or the one serving the food? And before they can begin to answer, he answers for them. It says, we all know who it is, but I'm telling you, I'm not here to be served, I'm here to serve. The same is true in the other Gospels. One poignant example would be the foot washing ceremony in the Gospel of John. Remember, we talked about this, and we were talking about a transition from a domination engagement, a way of being, to friendship, and how that paradigm affects you. So what does he mean when he says, be a servant? Obviously, we all have ideas of servanthood. There's just doing things for other people. Or servant leadership, which has as a core tenet the idea of recognizing talent and bringing it along. What else comes to your mind when I say servanthood? Wait, I don't want you to have to move without him attending to you. So,
Parenthood.
Parenthood. Well, if Julia in her sermon would agree with that, that's for sure. What about servanthood?
The ability to be selfless, to be more concerned about others than oneself. A little bit of sacrifice in that.
Selfless. I like, yeah.
Doing nice things for other people. When somebody's done something nice for you in business or at church, maybe perhaps you bake them a cake or prepare cookies or get a gift certificate
Mm-hmm.
and say thank you for doing
Mhm.
this. For instance, last year, I went by Kentucky Fried Chicken sitting up there on Highway 92, and it was on a Saturday. And I asked the ladies up there, I said, "Are you girls working tomorrow?" And they said yes. So after I finished here, I went back to the house and had 4 prepared baskets for the girls with the chickens and the covered eggs and some cologne samples from Rich's, and took it back to the girls. From Macy's. And they were appreciative of it. Do something nice for people to
Right.
make their day. They're having to work for us, so do something in return.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. We have a comment from our chat. The moderator has a comment. All right.
I think of being obligated and required. Yeah, I'd like for you to talk about that.
Obligated and required. Where's Mac? We need some marital counseling over here. Yeah. Servanthood, as if you were not there voluntarily, but somehow placed there involuntarily. I'll come back to that when I figure out a good answer.
It's giving time, talent, and money.
Time, talent, money, yeah. So I think we have a sense, these are wonderful answers, I think we have a sense of service, servanthood in terms of service, of doing something for others. And the way Chad Myers addresses this is through the theory, if you will, or practice of nonviolence, right? And so servanthood is that which generates a nonviolent community. And to make sense of that, I want to go and look at what is it that causes us to be servants. So maybe my answer to you lies in this analysis. What causes us to look out and notice the people at Kentucky Fried Chicken, be aware of the context in which you were encountering them, and react compassionately? Is it just knowing you're supposed to do that, or is it deeper? In order to explore that thought, I want to look at the concept of humility, right? The concept of humility, and in particular, humility as treated in the Rule of St. Benedict. This is the core of Benedictine spirituality, which interestingly enough, I think is probably the core of Anglican spirituality. So it's something that you can see in our tradition and see in our liturgies and see in the way we talk about our worldview. Now, the Rule of St. Benedict was crafted in the 6th century by St. Benedict of Nursia. It was designed to be a rule for men to live together in monasteries. And there are a number of rules floating around ever since the 4th century, when folks first went out into the desert and began to gather in what we now think of as a monastic vocation. But something about the Rule of Benedict has held on. It has been more meaningful to more people, and it has generated a number of other rules that are based on it. What I like about the rule is it's actually doable. It actually focuses on moderation and tries to encompass real life and not just some aesthetic ideal. Rowan Williams says in describing the Rule of St. Benedict, what Benedict is interesting in producing is people who have the skills to diagnose everything inside them that prompts them to escape from themselves in the here and now. This is back to the very same spiritual life that we've been talking about. And really what Rowan Williams is talking about is freedom. So in that sense, servanthood is rooted in freedom. But the way Benedict talks about it is humility. And he offers 12 steps to humility. Sounds like a reasonable number, right? 12 steps to humility, and I'm going to go through them quickly, but I don't want you to think of them as if they're ascending steps, like you're, even though Benedict does, like you're climbing the ladder until you get to heaven or become, in Benedictine vocabulary, a person of peace. Instead, I want you to think about them as different levels that you engage, and the object is to be engaged in all of them, not simply to be resident in the top rung of the ladder. So in the first step is to recognize that God is God. Now, the way I think about that is we go through life making a certain assumption. God was here before I got here, God's here right now, and God will be here after I leave. And that God is present, active, and loving. Now that sounds simple enough. But if you think about actually living into what those assumptions mean, it might change the way you think you have to be in that particular moment. When you are engaging another person in need, you are not the only one who's responsible for that person, acting with that person, accompanying that person. God is actually there too. So how do you not just remedy the problem that you think you see, but assist the Holy Spirit in acting in that person for their freedom? That, I think, is what Benedict is talking about. And every other step in the rule works toward that end. There's a story that Jane Tomaine tells in this wonderful book called St. Benedict's Toolbox. If you've not seen this book, it is in the bookstore. I know that's shocking to you. And you will love it because it goes through the rule and also gives you very specific practices. The story she tells is that there was a woman and she loved music. And in particular, she loved this particular symphony. And she was waiting for it to come to town, and she got a seat on exactly the place in Symphony Hall where she wanted to sit, right on the aisle, where the acoustics were perfect and her sight lines were exact. And as she got to the theater or Symphony Hall in advance, and she took her seat, and she got all ready for everything that she was about to experience, thinking ahead in her mind about what it would feel like and be like, this usher brought a young girl down. They came and they stopped at the end of the aisle, and the girl was kind of, well, smelly. She smelled of smoke, so the woman could assume that maybe her parents smoked, and she was a bit unkempt, her clothes kind of torn and tattered. And as she moved over, you know, those of you who've been to Symphony Hall, you kind of do that knee to the side thing, like, why weren't you here 15 minutes ago? They just stood there and waited for her to move over, out of the seat that she had chosen. She heard this little voice in the back of her head saying, just go ahead and move, be quiet, don't make any waves, and so she did. And the little girl sat down there and proceeded to unwrap several bags of candies, each of which were individually wrapped. And she proceeded to eat them throughout the entire concert, making all that rustling noise, not only dipping her hand into the bag, but unwrapping the candies. This slowly but surely drove the woman crazy. And she kept thinking, perhaps I'll just remind her of what my parents taught me, which is you don't do this in Symphony Hall because it's distracting. But then a little voice came up in her head and she said, just be quiet, be still, it'll be okay. Well, then the girl started tapping her foot to the music. And through those parts of the symphony that had a little pace to them, she would tap her foot even more loudly to the annoyance of those around her, which of course not only distracted the woman, but also created that sense of, I need to make sure they know she's not with me, right? As an aside, I went to the symphony with my mother once, who carefully put her purse down, and she looked at me and she said, I've put my cell phone, I've turned it off and I've put it in the purse. If I didn't do it right and it starts ringing, you kick it down the aisle. So the woman is sitting there having anticipated this moment, but it's being ruined by this strange girl who's doing everything you're not supposed to do. And it just gets worse and worse as her distractions increase in their power, but she hears this voice that says, be still. Don't move, don't do anything. Finally, she begins to actually enjoy the symphony. She's more focused on that, not so much the girl sitting beside her, and it comes to a wonderful conclusion, and she's had a good time despite this distraction. And then the girl gets up, somebody comes and gets her, and she leaves. And the woman in front turns around to the woman who was there and says, "Thank you. Do you know who that was?" And the woman says, "No, I've never seen her before." And said, "Well, she goes to my church. And she's the product of a family who's really had a lot of trouble. And we think she's probably been abused. And of course, you can tell that she lives in what amounts to an impoverished circumstance. She's here because we raised the money to let her come and be present at the symphony." I don't think anyone has ever told her that she was okay or worthy or belonged, but you did. In not correcting her and not chastising her and not punishing her, you recognized her, gave her some respect, told her she belonged here. I don't think that's ever happened before. It strikes me that's a wonderful story of humility, of paying attention, hearing the voice of God, discerning that voice from the other voices, and then acting out of it in love and compassion for another person. It certainly touches the other characteristics that you've identified of selflessness and compassion and focus and attention, but it wraps them into one thing. And so Benedict would say, how do we live our life like that, right? How do we go through living our life like that? The second step is simply that we take God's will as our prime directive. A good image for this might be Star Trek, right? Remember the prime directive? You can help, but you can't interfere. Remember every time they go to a new planet, a new culture, something would be wrong, and they'd have this crisis because they thought they knew what to do, but they couldn't mess with it. And then one episode, Roddenberry had to mess with it. It screwed up the rest of the timeline of history. I don't know. But nevertheless, that's another step of humility. There's more going on here than I actually fully recognize. And I need to be aware of my own limits as I fashion my response. I need to be aware of my own emotions as I determine what I should do. Discernment is about listening and responding, not reacting, right? Had the woman reacted to that little girl, she would have chastised her for 45 minutes through the concert. Her response, which turned out to be appropriate, actually had to do with creating a space for her and not chastising her at all. To do God's will is to respond, but not to react. In the rule, this is called obedience. We think of obedience as being told what to do, evidently. Not that that's ever happened to you at home. But obedience in the Benedictine rule follows its Latin definition, which is to listen and respond. And both listening and responding require humility, because if you're not paying attention without worrying about how this is going to impact you and how you're going to exercise coercive power and how you're going to make the world fall within your control since you know what to do, you can't hear what's being said. You can hear the words maybe, but you won't hear the music. Or you hear the music and you won't hear the words. You won't know what's in those spaces. Listening is about being attentive and respectful. And then responding is about not reacting, but doing what needs to be done, not to correct the problem you think you see, but for the life of the community. Throughout the Benedictine rule, and specifically this sense of humility, is a constant focus on the good of the community. That's what you wind up using as a touchstone to make these other decisions about what to do, right? What works to give life to the community. You'll be glad to know that we are not going to go through all 12 of these things. But there are a couple I do want to cite. One is practice self-disclosure. Have somebody your priest in the form of confession, a spiritual director, a good friend, somebody that you can be truthful with about what's going on with you. Because that's the way you learn the truth about yourself. And that's the way you grow. Somebody who can hear who you are and still love you for who you are. Somebody that can help you discern how you ought to be responding and not reacting to whatever the situation is. We have the right of confession, called reconciliation in the prayer book. We have spiritual directors who are trained in order to sit with you and help you discern how the Holy Spirit is active in your life. We have people willing to be friends. Sometimes in crisis, we do find ourselves in those places, but we can create a habit of being in those places, a habit of being vulnerable, a habit of allowing the intimacy that arises out of that vulnerability be part of our lives. And it's not just our personal life either, as Brene Brown has shown to great success, her own and ours. That vulnerability is necessary for the business environment as well, because, as Brene Brown says, it is the threshold for creativity. If you don't have vulnerability, you can't have creativity. And so now we have whole movements in leadership theories in business, for example, where telling failure stories has come to be part of what's good leadership. Let me tell you a story about how I didn't do this right, so you won't do it right too. And then people are able to listen to that without identifying that as the only thing that person is. Right? George told us about how he screwed that up, and now we think George is just a screw up. No. If that telling of failure stories is going to work, if vulnerability is part of your corporate culture, you're going to have to get to the place where you pay more attention than that, right? You know that what that person did wrong is not all that they are. And when leaders model that, then it gets into the corporate culture and you have a much more vibrant culture. So whether it's your personal life or your business life, that part of humility, I think, makes a lot of sense. The last one I want to talk about is menial tasks. Benedict says, do menial tasks. Don't think they're beneath you. I suspect everybody here has had some experience of that, something that needed to be done that just wasn't yours to do, that you didn't want to do, that doing would have felt beneath you. What's interesting to me are people, or all of us when we're there, who don't think that task is menial. Teachers, for example, who know that cutting out cardboard so students can do an art project is not a menial task, it's part of the development of the student, of the child. Or directors of preschools who tell me that if you've got a director of a preschool who rocks the children when they're crying, you get a different kind of preschool than if you're just in your office managing the budget and whatever else might be necessary. There aren't menial tasks when it has to do with other people, and they're not beneath you, it's just what needs to be done in the moment. Humility is that part of us that lets us see that. And doing that is the habit that makes us more humble, which leads to peace. So Benedict says. All right. I want to end then by saying that first and last and welcoming children are Jesus' response to arguing about who is the greatest. Because that's a misguided argument to begin with. It's not about the power that you accumulate, the self you think you've aggregated, as opposed to what anybody else has. Think, for example, of Paul's metaphor of the body of Christ. Do you remember in Corinthians when Paul says, I'm going to paraphrase here, but just because you're the eye doesn't mean you don't need the foot. Right? And you're thinking that somehow you're more important to the body than the rest only cripples the body. It's humility. It is what Benedict is driving toward in his 12 steps, which is, by the way, 19 paragraphs in the rule. He spends more time on that than anything else, because I think it's the core of that spirituality. And children, I think, are a concrete example, a sacrament of grace that helps us live out that Benedictine concept of humility. And so when you think of this passage anyway, I hope it will call us all back to a sense of humility and developing the habits that if we do day in and day out, will make us more humble, will make us sacraments of grace too. Amen. I was going to end with the, and I will end with that meditation of Howard Thurman again, but I want to say that it is now 11 o'clock, and those of you who are going to church or have other things to do, please feel free to leave during that meditation. But thank you for being here. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see one's self pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity we seek, ere the quiet passes, a fresh sense of order in our living. A direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis? And where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure? And what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. We wait. Our questions are answered. Our spirits refreshed. And we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down.